Detective Agatha Marple, Murder on the Majestic Cruise, a detective tales. The Majestic Queen sat like a regal swan upon the Thames, its pristine white hull gleaming in the faint winter sunlight. On the bustling dock below, stewards hurried with trunks and cases, their movements a carefully choreographed chasse. Passengers, adorned in furs, silks, and tailored suits, stepped aboard with expressions of expectation, wonder, or, in some cases, thinly veiled impatience. Agatha Marple ascended the gangway with quiet dignity, her plain woolen coat and modest hat setting her apart from the opulent crowd. She carried a single small suitcase, its worn leather handle betraying years of service. To the untrained eye she might have seemed inconspicuous, but for those who looked closer, and few ever did, there was an undeniable sharpness in her clear blue eyes, a kind of vigilant serenity that belied her unassuming appearance. Inside, the grand lobby of the Majestic Queen dazzled with Art Deco splendor. A massive crystal chandelier hung above, refracting light onto polished marble floors. Ornate railings spiraled up the grand staircase, and the hum of the ship's engine blended with the soft murmur of voices and the occasional peal of laughter. Agatha paused, taking it all in. The ship was a world unto itself, a floating palace where fortunes and secrets would sail across the Atlantic. "Allow me to show you to your cabin, madam," a steward said, appearing at her elbow with impeccable timing. "Thank you," Agatha replied, her voice calm and warm, as though she had nothing more pressing on her mind than unpacking. In truth, her gaze flickered over the other passengers as they filed past an elegant woman, trailing a faint scent of expensive perfume, a wiry man in a sharp suit glancing nervously at his pocket watch, and a young couple whispering conspiratorially. Each face carried its own story, and Agatha had always been adept at reading them. As the steward led her through the plush corridors to her modest cabin, Agatha allowed herself a faint smile. She had boarded the Majestic Queen ostensibly for a quiet holiday, but she had no illusions about the kind of intrigue that such luxury could attract. It seemed only a matter of time before something or someone would disturb the tranquil facade. Dinner was a grand affair in the ship's main dining room, a cavernous space lined with gleaming mirrors and gold accents. Waiters moved with military precision, balancing silver trays laden with dishes that filled the air with tantalizing aromas. Soft strains of a string quartet drifted from a raised platform, lending an air of refinement to the lively chatter. Agatha sat at a table near the center of the room, her unobtrusive presence allowing her to observe unnoticed. Around her, the passengers displayed a rich tapestry of personalities and dynamics. At one table, an American businessman guffawed loudly, his wife's forced smile hinting at her growing irritation. Across the room, a young artist sketched discreetly on a napkin, his gaze darting toward the glamorous woman dining alone, 2 tables away. The dining room quieted as the doors opened with a dramatic flourish. Sir Reginald Hawthorne entered, flanked by his valet, a severe-looking man with a military bearing. The tycoon was every bit the image of success, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed, his white mustache groomed to perfection. He walked with an air of command, as though the very ship were his domain. "That's Sir Reginald," a man at Agatha's table whispered, his tone equal parts awe and envy. "Hawthorne Shipping, Hawthorne Steel, you name it, he owns it." Agatha's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. Sir Reginald paused near the captain's table, greeting the ship's officers with a booming laugh and a firm handshake. As he moved toward his seat, whispers followed in his wake like a tide. Rumors of his wealth, his ruthless business tactics, and his legendary collection of artifacts swirled through the room. Some admired him, others despised him, but no one was indifferent. As Sir Reginald settled into his chair, his valet positioned himself discreetly behind him. The tycoon surveyed the room with a satisfied smile, raising his glass in a silent toast to himself. Agatha noted the way his gaze lingered a moment too long on a young woman at a nearby table, who quickly looked away, her cheeks flushed. "Quite the entrance," Agatha murmured to herself, her lips curving into the faintest smile. She had seen men like Sir Reginald before, larger than life, untouchable, and often with a web of secrets hidden beneath their imposing exteriors. As the string quartet struck a lively tune and the clinking of glasses resumed, Agatha turned her attention back to her plate. For now, the luxury of the Majestic Queen was holding its illusion, but Agatha could sense the faint ripples of unease beneath the surface. Something or someone was bound to disrupt it soon. The next morning, the Majestic Queen sailed through calm waters under a pale sky, its passengers stirring awake to the soft chime of the ship's morning bells. The corridors, once vibrant with chatter and laughter the night before, now carried only the faint murmur of stewards tending to their early duties. William Griggs, a seasoned steward with a habit of punctuality, approached Sir Reginald Hawthorne's cabin precisely at 8. It was his routine to deliver breakfast to the tycoon, who had made his preferences abundantly clear the previous evening: black coffee, toast lightly buttered, and a side of marmalade. Griggs balanced the silver tray with care, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting. He knocked twice. No response. "Sir Reginald?" Griggs called, his voice polite but firm. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. A flicker of unease crossed his face. Sir Reginald was not the sort of man to be late for anything, least of all his own breakfast. Griggs hesitated before unlocking the door with his master key, a privilege he rarely exercised. As the door swung open, the tray wobbled in his hand, and a gasp escaped his lips. Sir Reginald was seated in a large armchair by the window, his back to the door. At first glance he appeared to be napping, but something about his stillness felt unnatural. His head lolled to one side, and his eyes, half open, stared vacantly into the distance. "Sir." Griggs stepped closer, setting the tray down on a nearby table. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched Sir Reginald's shoulder. The chill beneath his fingers confirmed what his instincts had already told him. Sir Reginald Hawthorne was dead. Griggs' shout for help quickly brought other stewards to the scene, and within minutes, the ship's doctor, Dr. Oliver Wainwright, arrived. A small, serious man with a perpetually furrowed brow, Wainwright knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life he knew he wouldn't find. "It appears to be a heart attack," he announced after a brief examination, glancing at the gathered staff. "Natural causes, though sudden. I'll need to make a full report." Griggs, pale and visibly shaken, spoke up. "But sir, he seemed in such good health last night. He even danced a little after dinner." "Even the healthiest men can fall victim to the unexpected," Wainwright said curtly, rising to his feet. "There's no need for speculation." The scene might have ended there, with Sir Reginald's death recorded as a tragic but routine event. However, it was Griggs who, while tidying the cabin under the doctor's instructions, noticed something unusual. The small safe embedded in the cabin wall, something Sir Reginald had made a great show of the previous evening, was ajar. Griggs frowned, recalling how the tycoon had bragged about its impenetrability. Curiosity got the better of him. He knelt to peer inside, his breath caught. The safe was empty. Griggs straightened and turned to Wainwright. "Doctor," he said cautiously, "the safe, it's been emptied." Wainwright frowned, stepping closer. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely," Griggs replied. "He kept some artifacts in here, priceless ones, or so he said." The doctor's frown deepened. "This changes things. Inform the captain immediately, and we'll need to keep this quiet. For now." By mid-morning, news of Sir Reginald's death had already begun to spread among the passengers, though the details remained murky. Some whispered of a tragic accident, others of foul play. In the dining room, where the morning sun glinted off fine china and crystal, the usual clatter of breakfast service was subdued, replaced by hushed conversations and furtive glances. Agatha Marple, seated alone at her table, sipped her tea thoughtfully. She had seen the stewards rushing to and from Sir Reginald's cabin earlier and noted their pale faces and stiff movements. It was clear something significant had occurred. When a steward passed nearby, she caught his eye. "Excuse me," she said kindly, her voice low enough not to draw attention, "but is everything all right this morning? There seems to be an unusual energy about." The steward hesitated, glancing around before leaning in slightly. "Sir Reginald Hawthorne, madam. He passed away this morning. Heart attack, they say." Agatha's brow furrowed, though her expression remained calm. How dreadful! Such a prominent man, and so unexpectedly. "Yes, madam. But between you and me it may not be so simple. The captain has been called, and there's talk of something missing from his cabin." "Missing?" Agatha repeated, her tone mildly curious. "Yes, madam. A safe, emptied." Agatha set her teacup down, her fingers lingering on the delicate handle. "How unfortunate," she murmured, her sharp mind already piecing together the edges of a puzzle. As the steward hurried off, Agatha leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting to the window where the vast ocean stretched endlessly. Beneath the calm surface of the Majestic Queen's morning routine, she sensed the currents of something far more sinister. Something told her this was no ordinary heart attack. The announcement of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's untimely demise rippled through the Majestic Queen like an unseen tide, its presence felt in the hushed conversations and furtive glances exchanged in the hallways and lounges. Despite the efforts of the captain and crew to maintain an air of calm, the ship's once effortless gaiety now carried a brittle edge. Agatha Marple sat in a high-backed chair in the lounge, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She had chosen a vantage point near the grand piano, where the guests naturally congregated. Her sharp eyes flitted unobtrusively from face to face as snippets of conversation drifted her way, muffled by the muted strains of the pianist's melancholic tune. Across the room, Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, Sir Reginald's estranged wife, sat stiffly on a chaise lounge. She held a lace handkerchief to her lips, her pale complexion and trembling fingers lending her an air of fragile grief. Yet, Agatha noted, there was something in her gaze that seemed more calculated than sorrowful, a glint of triumph, perhaps, or relief. Nearby, Charles Emery, a dashing art dealer with a roguish charm, leaned casually against the bar. "Terrible business, isn't it?" he said, his voice carrying to Agatha's ears despite his conversational tone. "Hawthorne always struck me as indestructible." He smirked into his glass of bourbon, his expression betraying more amusement than sympathy. Dr. Hildegard Braun, the stoic German archaeologist, appeared far less interested in mourning the deceased. She sat at a small table by the window, leafing through a thick journal. Her sharp features were set in a mask of indifference, though the tightness in her jaw betrayed a hidden tension. At the far corner of the room, Thomas Blake, a nervous young steward, busied himself polishing an already gleaming brass lamp. His movements were brisk, his eyes darting to the clock on the wall as though counting down to an unspoken deadline. Agatha watched him fumble with a cloth, her needles pausing mid-click. "Excuse me, madam." A voice broke her concentration. Millie Harper, the ship's bartender, approached with her usual grace. "Would you care for some tea? Or perhaps something stronger, given the morning's developments?" "Tea, please," Agatha replied with a warm smile. She studied Millie as she departed, noting the faint shadows under her eyes and the tightness in her shoulders. Millie was always poised, yet today her steps seemed just a touch hurried. As Agatha resumed her knitting, her mind worked tirelessly, weaving observations together like the wool in her hands. Lady Eleanor's apparent fragility, Charles's barely concealed disdain, Dr. Braun's stoic indifference, and Blake's jittery demeanor all were pieces of a puzzle she had yet to fully understand. And yet, amidst the whispers and sidelong glances, Agatha felt a deeper tension in the air, one not born of grief but of fear. Sir Reginald's death was a disruption not just to the luxury of the Majestic Queen, but to the careful balance of secrets that its passengers carried with them. Agatha's lips curved into a faint smile, her expression one of quiet determination. "The game is afoot," she murmured to herself, her needles resuming their rhythmic dance. If there was one thing Agatha Marple knew, it was that people often revealed more in their silence than in their words. All she had to do was listen. Captain Lionel Harrington stood at the head of the ship's modest conference room, a towering figure in his pristine uniform. His face, deeply lined from years at sea, betrayed none of the mounting tension swirling through the Majestic Queen. Around the polished oak table sat key members of the staff, Dr. Oliver Wainwright, and a select few passengers of interest, including, of course, Agatha Marple. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrington began, his voice steady but edged with authority. "As you are undoubtedly aware, Sir Reginald Hawthorne passed away under sudden and tragic circumstances. However," he continued, his steely gaze sweeping the room, "it has come to light that his personal safe was forcibly opened, and its contents, a collection of rare artifacts, are missing." The announcement landed like a crack of thunder, met with a collective gasp from some and a studied silence from others. Agatha noted the reactions with care. Lady Eleanor pressed her handkerchief tighter to her lips, while Charles Emery leaned forward with an almost predatory glint in his eye. Dr. Hildegard Braun, meanwhile, adjusted her spectacles with a sharp, practiced motion, her expression inscrutable. "What sort of artifacts are we talking about, Captain?" Charles asked, his voice tinged with curiosity that bordered on avarice. "Priceless relics," Harrington replied, "acquired by Sir Reginald during his many ventures into the Middle East and Africa. Some have speculated about their origins." His tone turned measured, almost cautious. "There have been rumors that they were not always obtained by strictly legal means." A murmur rippled through the room. Agatha noticed Dr. Braun's lips twitch, ever so slightly, as though suppressing a remark, while Lady Eleanor appeared to shrink into herself. "The authorities will be informed as soon as we dock in New York," Harrington continued. "Until then, I ask all passengers to remain calm and cooperative. If anyone has any information, anything at all, I urge you to come forward." The captain's gaze lingered on Agatha for a fraction of a second, as though sensing that the quiet woman in her modest dress might hold the key to uncovering the truth. The lounge was quieter now, the earlier buzz of gossip dampened by an air of unease. Agatha Marple sat near the grand piano, her knitting resting idly in her lap. Her demeanor was as placid as ever, but her sharp eyes darted from one corner of the room to another, alighting on each suspect in turn. Lady Eleanor was her first target. The widow sat alone near the window, gazing out at the endless expanse of ocean with a distant, melancholy air. Agatha approached with the soft tread of someone who never wished to startle. "Such a dreadful business," Agatha murmured as she sat beside her, drawing her knitting back into her lap. "Sir Reginald's death, I mean. You must be devastated." Lady Eleanor turned to her, her expression a careful blend of sadness and restraint. "Yes," she said softly. "It was a shock." Agatha allowed a beat of silence to pass before continuing. "It seems he was quite the collector. Those artifacts of his must have been a point of pride." Eleanor hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her handkerchief. "He was very proud of them," she said finally. "Though I dare say his methods of acquisition left much to be desired." Agatha's knitting needles clicked softly as she spoke. "Were there ever disputes over them? People who might have felt wronged?" Eleanor's lips parted slightly, but then she shook her head. "I wouldn't know. Reginald kept his dealings very private." Agatha nodded, as if satisfied, though her mind filed away Eleanor's reluctance to elaborate. Next, she turned her attention to Charles Emery, who lounged by the bar, swirling a glass of cognac in his hand. "You seem remarkably composed, Mr. Emery," she observed as she approached. "One might almost think you were unaffected by all this." Charles glanced at her with a bemused smile. "One must maintain a certain detachment, Miss Marple, particularly in such delicate situations. Grief and panic serve no one." "Wise words," Agatha replied, her tone light. "Though I wonder, was your relationship with Sir Reginald one of mutual admiration or something else?" Charles chuckled, a sound that was both charming and hollow. "Admiration? Hardly. Sir Reginald and I had our differences. He was a shrewd man, and let's just say he didn't always play fair when it came to business. So there were conflicts." Agatha pressed, her needles moving rhythmically. Charles shrugged, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Nothing out of the ordinary. But if you're suggesting I had a motive for—" He trailed off, waving his hand dismissively. "Let's not get carried away, Miss Marple." Agatha said nothing, but as she moved on to her next subject, she felt certain Charles was concealing something. Her final conversation of the morning was with Dr. Hildegard Braun, who sat stiffly in a corner with her notebook. The archaeologist barely looked up as Agatha approached, but she nodded curtly when addressed. "You must have been familiar with Sir Reginald's collection," Agatha began, her tone pleasant. "I was," Dr. Braun said tersely. "It was impressive, though much of it was obtained through dubious means." "And you disapproved of these means?" Agatha asked. Dr. Braun's eyes snapped up to meet hers. "Any scholar worth their salt would disapprove. Those artifacts belong in museums, not in private collections." "Yet you didn't challenge him directly," Agatha pressed. Dr. Braun's mouth tightened. "I prefer to avoid unnecessary conflicts, Miss Marple. Sir Reginald was a powerful man, and it is dangerous to cross such individuals." Agatha noted the tension in Dr. Braun's shoulders, the way her hands gripped her notebook. A woman of principle, perhaps, but one who had learned to tread carefully. As the morning wore on, Agatha's suspicions began to crystallize. Each passenger had their secrets, their reasons to resent Sir Reginald, but which of them had turned resentment into action? The threads of the mystery were beginning to weave together, though the pattern was far from clear. For now, Agatha knew only one thing for certain. On the Majestic Queen, the truth was as elusive as the horizon. The Majestic Queen was cloaked in an eerie stillness as midnight approached. The grandeur of the ship seemed almost spectral under the dim glow of its corridor lights. Outside, the ocean was an endless void, broken only by the occasional ripple of moonlight on the waves. Agatha Marple moved with quiet purpose through the silent halls, her soft slippers masking her steps. The day's events had left her restless. The whispers of stolen artifacts, the hushed denial in Lady Eleanor's voice, the feigned indifference of Charles Emery all swirled in her mind like an unsolved puzzle. Unable to sleep, she had taken to walking the corridors, hoping the solitude might untangle her thoughts. Then she saw it. A shadow slipping out of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's cabin. The figure moved with haste, their silhouette briefly illuminated by the faint light spilling from a nearby wall sconce. Agatha stopped, her heart quickening, though her expression remained calm. The figure was tall, wrapped in a dark overcoat, their features obscured by the angle of their hat. They hesitated for only a moment, as though ensuring they were unobserved, before disappearing down the corridor toward the crew quarters. Agatha didn't hesitate. Setting her knitting bag down discreetly on a nearby bench, she followed, her steps light and deliberate. The air grew heavier as she descended into the ship's lower decks. The opulence of the passenger quarters gave way to the functional austerity of the crew's domain, narrow hallways lined with bare metal walls, the hum of the ship's engine a constant undercurrent. Here the scent of polished wood and perfumed air was replaced with something earthier, oil, dampness, and the faint tang of salt water. Ahead, the figure turned a corner, their pace quick but measured. Agatha slowed, pressing herself against the cool wall, careful to stay out of sight. She heard the faint creak of a door opening and closing, followed by silence. Agatha reached the corner and peered around cautiously. The figure was gone, but a door to a storage room stood ajar, its hinges still swaying slightly. She approached, pausing just outside, her keen eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The storage room was dimly lit, its shelves lined with cleaning supplies, folded linens, and crates bearing the ship's emblem. It was empty, or so it seemed. Agatha stepped inside, her gaze sweeping the space. She noted the faint indentations in the dust on one of the crates, as though something had been hastily placed and then removed. Her fingers brushed against the surface, picking up a faint residue of oil. It was an odd detail, but she tucked it away in her mind. Before she could investigate further, a distant sound, perhaps the clatter of boots on metal stairs, caught her attention. The figure was long gone. Agatha stood in the quiet of the room, her thoughts racing. Whoever had left Sir Reginald's cabin had clearly been in a hurry, but their destination here raised more questions than answers. What could they have wanted in the crew quarters? And why had they been in the late tycoon's room at all? As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on something half hidden beneath a shelf, a torn scrap of fabric. It was dark and fine, likely part of a jacket. She knelt to retrieve it, tucking it into the pocket of her robe. The corridors were deserted as Agatha made her way back to her cabin. She retrieved her knitting bag from its place on the bench, her calm composure belying the intrigue swirling in her mind. The night had revealed something important, though she couldn't yet see the full shape of it. The shadowy figure, the storage room, the faint traces of oil, and the fabric scrap were all threads waiting to be woven together. As she reached her cabin door, she paused, her hand on the brass handle. A faint smile curved her lips. "Secrets don't stay hidden for long," she murmured to herself. "Not on a ship like this." And with that, she disappeared into the quiet sanctuary of her room, ready to face whatever the next day might bring. The lounge of the Majestic Queen had taken on a different tone in the wake of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's death. The soft hum of conversation lacked its usual vibrancy, replaced by an undercurrent of unease. Even the cheerful glint of crystal glasses catching the light felt muted, as if the ship itself were withholding its usual brilliance. Agatha Marple, seated unobtrusively near the grand piano, observed the room like a sparrow watching the shifting winds. She began her delicate work, weaving a web of conversation, drawing out details, and, most importantly, listening. Each suspect presented their own peculiar cadence, their own rhythm of truth and half-truth. Agatha knew well that people rarely lied outright, they simply omitted the parts that mattered. Agatha's first target was Lady Eleanor, who sat by the large bay window, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the rim of her untouched teacup. She was the picture of fragile grace, wrapped in a pale blue silk gown that seemed just slightly too opulent for mourning. Agatha approached with a usual quiet demeanor, her knitting needles clicking softly as she settled into the chair beside her. "What a dreadful shock this must be for you, Lady Eleanor," Agatha began, her tone warm with sympathy. "To lose your husband so suddenly, and aboard a ship no less." Lady Eleanor sighed, a sound more resigned than sorrowful. "We had been estranged for years, Miss Marple. It's a strange thing, grief. One mourns not what was lost, but what might have been." Agatha's needles paused mid-click, a faint smile on her lips. "Indeed, and yet the bond of marriage is not so easily severed, is it? Did you have occasion to speak with Sir Reginald during the voyage?" Eleanor's hand tightened briefly on her cup before releasing. "No," she said softly. "He avoided me, as was his custom. I suppose the only surprise is that he did not leave some dramatic insult in his will. Though," she added, her voice turning wry, "there may still be time for that." Agatha chuckled lightly, but her eyes were sharp. Eleanor's bitterness was clear, but beneath it there was something else, a flicker of fear, or perhaps relief. Charles Emery was an altogether different creature, lounging near the bar with the languid ease of a man who never worried too deeply about anything. He greeted Agatha with a charming smile as she approached, gesturing for the bartender to pour her a sherry. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth as silk, "what a pleasure to see you. You do bring a certain refinement to the room." Agatha accepted the glass with a polite nod. "You flatter me, Mr. Emery, though I imagine you're quite accustomed to refinement yourself, given your profession." Charles laughed softly, his expression amused. "Art is a refined pursuit, to be sure, though the business side of it can be less so. Sir Reginald and I had our little disagreements on that front." "Ah, yes, his artifacts," Agatha said lightly. "I understand they were quite valuable." "Valuable enough to make enemies, I'd wager," Charles replied, his eyes glinting. "Reginald was an astute collector, but not always a scrupulous one. It's no secret he and I operated in adjacent markets." Agatha tilted her head slightly. "And did these markets ever overlap?" Charles's smile widened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Only briefly, Miss Marple. And always to our mutual benefit, of course." Dr. Hildegard Braun sat at a small table near the fireplace, her posture as rigid as the high-backed chair she occupied. Her thin spectacles perched on the edge of her nose as she flipped through a thick book with measured precision. Agatha approached with care, her knitting abandoned for the moment. "Dr. Braun," she said warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting." The historian looked up, her expression neutral but watchful. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Please sit." Agatha lowered herself into the chair opposite. "I understand you and Sir Reginald shared a professional acquaintance." Dr. Braun's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wouldn't call it an acquaintance exactly. I led several excavations in Mesopotamia where Sir Reginald acquired his so-called treasures. Let us say we disagreed on the ethical boundaries of such acquisitions." "Ah," Agatha murmured, her tone thoughtful. "And were these disagreements ever resolved?" "Hardly," Dr. Braun replied, her tone clipped. "Sir Reginald was a man who believed that might made right. He thought his wealth and influence absolved him of moral obligations." Agatha studied the woman carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders and the faint flush creeping up her neck. "It must have been difficult," she said gently, watching those artifacts taken from their rightful place. Dr. Braun's hand tightened on the book. "Difficult does not begin to describe it." Thomas Blake, the steward who had discovered Sir Reginald's body, was found polishing silverware in a quiet corner of the dining room. His hands moved methodically, but his eyes darted nervously toward the room's entrances, as if expecting something or someone. "Mr. Blake," Agatha said softly, approaching him with an encouraging smile. "Might I have a word?" Blake nearly dropped the fork he was holding but managed a hasty nod. "Oh, of course, Mom. Anything I can do to help." "You must be terribly shaken," Agatha began, "finding Sir Reginald like that." Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. It wasn't something I'd care to experience again, Ma'am." He looked so cold. "And yet," Agatha pressed gently, "you seem more nervous now than one might expect. Did you notice anything unusual that morning? Or in the days before?" Blake hesitated, his eyes darting away. I wouldn't know, ma'am. I just do my job. Don't like to get involved." Agatha leaned in slightly, her voice soothing. "Sometimes, Mr. Blake, it's the smallest details that make the biggest difference." Blake glanced around, then lowered his voice. "I saw someone," he whispered, "late that night near Sir Reginald's cabin. They didn't see me, but I saw them." "Who?" Agatha asked, her tone calm but insistent. Blake shook his head. I couldn't say. It was too dark." Agatha's eyes narrowed, but she offered him a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Mr. Blake. You've been very helpful." As Agatha returned to her seat near the piano, she considered the threads of information she had gathered. Each suspect had a motive, and each was hiding something. But who among them had turned their resentment into murder? The web was growing more tangled, and Agatha knew it would take all her skill to unravel it. The Majestic Queen was silent, except for the gentle creak of its wooden panels and the distant hum of the engine, a lullaby for those aboard who sought restful sleep. Agatha Marple, however, was wide awake, seated at the small writing desk in her cabin, the soft light of her reading lamp casting a warm glow across the room. A steaming cup of tea sat untouched beside a neatly folded letter, her thoughts too restless to allow for either correspondence or comfort. Her mind lingered on the day's conversations, each word, each glance, each hesitation replaying in meticulous detail. She had learned long ago that secrets were like spiders. They spun intricate webs, sometimes too fine to see, but always catchable with the right patience and a steady hand. And there were plenty of webs aboard this ship, each passenger seemingly entangled in their own. A sudden sound of faint scrape broke her concentration. Agatha's sharp eyes darted to the door. Someone had slipped something beneath it. Rising with quiet purpose, she moved across the cabin and retrieved the object, a folded piece of cream-colored paper. She turned it over in her hands, noting its ordinary texture and lack of any identifying marks. A faint scent of tobacco clung to it. Slowly she unfolded the note, revealing its stark message scrawled in jagged letters. "Ask too many questions, and you may never reach New York." Agatha stared at the words, her expression calm, but her mind alert. The handwriting was unsteady, suggesting either haste or an attempt at disguise. The choice of ink, a rich navy blue, suggested someone with access to finer stationery supplies, though the crude phrasing was incongruous with such refinement. Her lips curved into a faint smile, though not one of amusement. "How charmingly predictable," she murmured to herself. A warning, veiled in the thinnest of threats, was a classic gambit for those desperate to silence prying eyes. What it truly revealed, however, was fear. Someone aboard this ship was rattled, and fear, Agatha knew, often led to mistakes. She moved to her desk and sat down, holding the note to the light. The faint indentation of pressure marks suggested a heavy hand or, perhaps, agitation. She reached for her pen and jotted a note to herself. "Tobacco scent smoker. Rushed handwriting, time-sensitive. Unsteady, deliberate misdirection or nervousness." Agatha's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door, soft, hesitant. Folding the note neatly, she tucked it into her writing case before calling, "Come in." The door opened to reveal Millie Harper, the ship's bartender. Her usually steady composure was replaced by an air of unease, her hands twisting a white handkerchief. "Miss Marple," Millie began, her voice low. "I didn't mean to disturb you, but I saw something earlier. Something that might be important." Agatha gestured for her to sit. "Not a disturbance at all, my dear." "Please, go on." Millie perched on the edge of the armchair, her brow furrowed. "I was coming up from the storeroom, late just after the second dinner service. I passed by Sir Reginald's cabin, and I saw someone standing outside his door." "Someone?" Agatha prompted gently, her expression encouraging. Millie nodded. "I couldn't see their face, just their back. They were tall, wearing a dark coat. It seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time." She hesitated, then added, "I didn't say anything earlier because I thought it might be nothing." "Everything is something, Millie," Agatha said with a reassuring smile. "Do you remember anything else? A scent, perhaps? Tobacco or cologne?" Millie frowned in thought. "Now that you mention it, I did catch a whiff of something. Tobacco, I think. The strong kind cigars, maybe." Agatha's fingers brushed the edge of the anonymous note in her writing case. "You've been very helpful, Millie. Thank you for trusting me with this." Millie stood, still clutching her handkerchief. "Do you think it means anything?" "Everything means something," Agatha replied, her tone calm but deliberate. "It's simply a matter of arranging the pieces." After Millie left, Agatha returned to her desk, her thoughts sharper now, slicing through the day's events with surgical precision. A shadowy figure at Sir Reginald's cabin. The scent of tobacco linking the warning to the scene. The sense of urgency in the note, written in haste and perhaps under duress. She reached for her teacup, taking a small sip as she considered the possibilities. Fear was indeed a powerful motivator, but it was also a revealing one. Whoever had sent the note had exposed themselves in their desperation. All Agatha needed to do was watch and wait. As she extinguished her lamp and climbed into bed, the note remained tucked under her pillow, a silent reminder of the storm gathering aboard the Majestic Queen. And as sleep claimed her, Agatha Marple dreamed not of rest but of unraveling the threads of a mystery slowly coming together under her patient hand. The cabin of Sir Reginald Hawthorne, though untouched since the morning of his death, bore an atmosphere of disquiet. The grand suite, with its plush furnishings and polished brass fixtures, seemed incongruously lifeless, as though the room itself mourned its late occupant. Agatha Marple stood at the threshold, her hands lightly clasped before her, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "Take as much time as you need, Miss Marple," Captain Harrington said, his tone resigned but respectful. He lingered briefly before departing, his presence a reluctant acknowledgement of Agatha's sharp intellect. The room was unnervingly pristine. Sir Reginald's armchair, where he had been found, was positioned precisely by the window, the light catching the faint sheen of the leather. Agatha's gaze moved to the heavy desk against the far wall, its surface free of papers or personal effects, a curious absence for a man of Sir Reginald's stature. Agatha approached the bathroom first, her steps soundless on the thick carpet. The gleaming sink and gold-edged mirror reflected no obvious clues, but her hand paused as it brushed against a damp cloth draped neatly over the towel rack. She frowned. Why had it not dried after so many hours? A closer inspection revealed faint traces of a chemical scent, sharp and acrid. She tucked the observation away. Returning to the main room, Agatha knelt to inspect the plush rug beneath the armchair. Her fingers ran over the fabric, stopping at a subtle ridge in the weave. The rug had been moved recently and not replaced properly, a small detail, but one that suggested tampering. She shifted the chair slightly, revealing a faint scuff mark on the polished floorboards beneath. Someone had repositioned the furniture, though whether to conceal or mislead was yet unclear. Finally, she turned her attention to the safe embedded in the wall. Its heavy door hung ajar, the interior yawning empty. Agatha ran a gloved finger along the edge, pausing at a faint series of scratches near the lock. They were shallow but erratic, as though made in haste or desperation. The culprit had not been as skilled or as composed as they likely wished to appear. Agatha stepped back, surveying the room as a whole. The damp cloth, the misaligned rug, the scratches on the safe, they were the threads of a story, not yet fully woven. But one thing was clear: Sir Reginald's death was no accident. The scene had been meticulously, though imperfectly, staged to give the appearance of natural causes. Her lips curved into a faint smile. "How untidy," she murmured to herself. "They'll have to do better than this." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the deck as Agatha made her way to the lounge. The tension aboard the Majestic Queen had grown more palpable, the ship's passengers moving with the subdued energy of those waiting for the inevitable unraveling of secrets. Inside, Charles Emery was seated by the bar, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, and an expression of practiced nonchalance on his face. Across the room, Lady Eleanor Hawthorne sat near the piano, her posture stiff as she stared out at the horizon. Agatha noted the distance between them, a calculated separation that only drew more attention to their shared discomfort. As she approached, Millie Harper intercepted her with an urgent whisper. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know someone saw Mr. Emery and Lady Eleanor arguing with Sir Reginald the night before he died." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly. Did they now? And did this someone happen to overhear what was said? Millie hesitated, then shook her head. No, ma'am, just raised voices. But it couldn't have been pleasant. Agatha nodded, her expression thoughtful. Thank you, Millie. You've been most helpful. Later, as Agatha descended to the crew quarters, her path crossed with Thomas Blake. The steward's usual nervous energy was amplified, his hands fumbling with a small, wrapped bundle that he attempted to tuck under his arm. He froze when he saw Agatha, his face draining of color. Good evening, Mr. Blake, Agatha said mildly, her gaze falling to the bundle. What have you there? Nothing, Miss Marple, he stammered, his voice high-pitched and unconvincing. Agatha's brow arched. You seem rather protective of nothing. Might I have a look? Blake hesitated, his fingers tightening around the bundle. Then, as though the weight of her gaze was too much, he handed it over with trembling hands. Agatha unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small, intricately carved artifact to figure in. No more than 6 inches tall, its surface weathered, but unmistakably valuable. Interesting, Agatha murmured, turning the figurine in her hands. And where, pray tell, did you acquire this? I found it, Blake blurted out, his voice desperate. It was in the storeroom. I thought no one would miss it. Agatha studied him closely, noting the sheen of sweat on his brow and the twitch in his fingers. The storeroom, you say? She repeated softly. How fortunate for you to stumble across such a treasure. And yet, one must wonder how it came to be there at all. Blake's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. Agatha returned the artifact to its wrapping, her expression serene. Thank you, Mr. Blake. You may go. As he fled down the corridor, Agatha allowed herself a moment of contemplation. The figurine, like the scratches on the safe, and the damp cloth in Sir Reginald's cabin, was another thread in the growing tapestry of deceit. The connections were forming, though the picture remained incomplete. For now, she had all the information she needed. The truth, as always, was just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The dining saloon of the Majestic Queen was a symphony of genteel clinks and muted murmurs, the subdued elegance of afternoon tea unmarred by the tension lurking just beneath the surface. The gilded chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, casting reflections on the polished silverware and delicate china. Agatha Marple, seated near the bay window with her knitting in hand, sipped her tea and watched the interplay of passengers with the calm detachment of a hawk surveying the field. At the center of the room, a storm was brewing. Charles Emery, lounging in his chair with the air of a man to whom discomfort was a foreign concept, set down his teacup with deliberate precision. It does make one think, he said in a voice just loud enough to carry, how terribly convenient it is for some people when Sir Reginald is no longer here to dispute certain claims. The room grew quieter, heads turning toward Lady Eleanor Hawthorne, who sat a few tables away. Her spine stiffened, her hand faltering over the teapot she had been pouring from. She looked up sharply, her face a careful mask of controlled indignation. "Are you implying something, Mr. Emery?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with steel. Emery leaned back in his chair, the hint of a smirk playing at his lips. "Oh, not at all, my dear lady. I merely observe. You must admit your history with Sir Reginald does raise certain questions. And after all, there's that little matter of the artifacts." A ripple of whispers spread through the room, curiosity and judgment mingling in equal measure. Agatha, her knitting needles clicking softly, observed the scene with keen interest. The moment had all the hallmarks of a confrontation destined to escalate, and she decided it was time to intervene. She rose from her chair with a quiet dignity and moved toward the table where Emery and Lady Eleanor faced off. "How fascinating, Mr. Emery," she said lightly, her tone as breezy as a spring afternoon. "You've brought us all to the edge of our seats. Do tell, what exactly are you insinuating?" Emery's smirk faltered, though he quickly recovered. "Merely making an observation, Miss Marple," he said with a shrug. "Lady Eleanor's financial situation has been the subject of some speculation, and Sir Reginald's demise might be seen as, shall we say, a fortuitous turn of events." Lady Eleanor's cheeks flushed a deep crimson, though whether from anger or embarrassment was unclear. "How dare you?" she began, but Agatha raised a hand, her expression serene. "Let us for a moment consider the logic of your suggestion," Agatha said, her voice steady and precise. "You imply that Lady Eleanor might have orchestrated her estranged husband's death out of financial desperation. And yet, Sir Reginald's will has not been read, and any assumption about its contents would be mere conjecture. Unless, of course, you are privy to information the rest of us are not. The room grew silent. Emery opened his mouth, then closed it again, his expression momentarily flustered. Agatha pressed on. Moreover, I find it curious that you are so quick to direct suspicion toward Lady Eleanor, when her presence at the time of Sir Reginald's death was well documented. She was in the main lounge, in full view of half the ship, and yet you seem rather eager to cast aspersions. Emery's smirk returned, though it lacked its earlier confidence. Just playing devil's advocate, Miss Marple. Ah, yes, Agatha replied, her smile thin. And how fitting that such advocacy often serves to obscure the truth rather than illuminate it. There was a faint chuckle from one corner of the room, quickly stifled. Lady Eleanor, regaining her composure, straightened in her chair and met Agatha's gaze with a look of gratitude. Emery, clearly aware that he had lost the upper hand, reached for his glass and took a long sip, saying nothing further. Agatha returned to her seat, her needles resuming their rhythmic motion as the room's tension began to dissipate. As she sipped her now cooling tea, Agatha's mind worked through the implications of the exchange. Emery's accusation had been clumsy, but it had served its purpose to redirect suspicion. Whether he was deflecting guilt from himself or simply muddying the waters for his own amusement, she could not yet say. But one thing was certain: Emery, like so many aboard this ship, was hiding something. The threads of the mystery were tightening, and Agatha Marple, ever patient, was ready to pull them taut. The lower deck corridor of the Majestic Queen was a world apart from the grand opulence of the upper decks. Its narrow walls, lined with exposed piping and painted a dull grey, seemed to press inward, amplifying the faint hum of the ship's engine. The air was cooler here, tinged with salt and oil, and the occasional creak of the ship echoed like whispers in the dim light. Agatha Marple waited, her calm demeanour masking the sharp anticipation that coursed through her. She had chosen her vantage point carefully, near the entrance to the storeroom where Thomas Blake, the nervous young steward, had been seen slipping moments earlier. When his tentative footsteps approached, she stepped forward, her small frame blocking his path. "Mr. Blake," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I wonder if I might have a word." Blake froze, his face pale under the flickering overhead light. He clutched a small bundle of linens, his knuckles white against the fabric. "Miss Marple," he stammered, his eyes darting down the corridor as though seeking an escape route. I'm terribly busy at the moment." "I think not," Agatha interrupted gently, her tone leaving no room for argument. "In fact, I suspect you've been rather preoccupied with something else entirely. Perhaps you'd like to tell me about it." Blake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing like a buoy in choppy waters. I don't know what you mean," he mumbled, though his trembling hands betrayed him. Agatha stepped closer, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Come now, Mr. Blake. You were seen near Sir Reginald's cabin the night he died, and I happen to know you've been handling certain items from his safe. It would be far better for you to explain yourself now, before someone else asks less kindly." Blake's breathing quickened, and for a moment it seemed as though he might bolt. But the weight of Agatha's calm certainty held him in place. He glanced around the corridor once more, then sagged against the wall, the linens slipping from his grasp. "I didn't kill him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't kill him." Agatha's expression softened, though her resolve remained firm. "I believe you," she said, "but I also believe you know far more than you've let on. Start from the beginning, Mr. Blake. Tell me everything." Blake drew a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the corridor railing as though it might steady him. "It started 2 nights ago," he began, his words spilling out in a rush. "I got a note slipped under my door. It said I was to open Sir Reginald's safe and take out what was inside." "A note?" Agatha prompted, her tone careful. "From whom? I don't know," Blake admitted miserably. "It wasn't signed. But it said they knew about my sister, about how she's been struggling to make ends meet. They said if I didn't do what they asked, they'd make sure she lost her job and worse." Agatha's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the safe? How did you manage to open it?" Blake hesitated, then reached into his pocket and produced a small, crude tool, a makeshift lockpick. I've had to do odd jobs before," he muttered, his voice heavy with shame. "Nothing serious, you understand. Just to get by." "They must have known." Agatha took the tool, examining it briefly before tucking it into her bag. And what was in the safe? Blake's gaze darted toward the floor. "Artifacts," he said. "Small ones, figurines, a few documents. I didn't know what they were. I just wrapped them up and left them in the storeroom, like the note said." "And then?" Agatha asked, her voice a quiet thread pulling at his unraveling confession. "I put everything in a crate marked for provisions," Blake said. I thought that would be the end of it. But the next morning Sir Reginald was dead, and I knew I'd made a terrible mistake." Agatha regarded him for a long moment, her expression inscrutable. "Why didn't you come forward?" she asked at last. Blake let out a bitter laugh, a hollow sound in the narrow corridor. "And say what? That I was blackmailed into stealing from Sir Reginald's safe? Who'd believe me, Miss Marple? I'm just a steward." Agatha placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've done the right thing by telling me," she said gently. "Now, listen carefully, Mr. Blake. Whoever coerced you into this is not finished. They've already gone to great lengths to manipulate and intimidate you, and they may do worse if they feel threatened. You must be cautious." Blake nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. "What should I do?" "Go about your duties as usual," Agatha instructed. "Say nothing to anyone, and if you receive another note or see anything unusual, you come to me immediately." As Blake hurried away, Agatha lingered in the corridor, her mind working swiftly through the pieces of the puzzle. The shadowy figure behind the theft, the use of Blake as an unwitting pawn, the deliberate targeting of Sir Reginald's safe, it all pointed to a deeper conspiracy, one rooted in greed and desperation. The truth, she knew, was still obscured beneath layers of deceit, but the threads were beginning to come together, and Agatha Marple was prepared to follow them wherever they led. Agatha Marple sat in the quiet of the ship's library, the polished wood paneling and deep armchairs creating an air of understated sophistication. In her lap rested a notebook, its pages filled with careful notations. Beside her, the faint aroma of tea lingered in a delicate porcelain cup, long since cooled. Thomas Blake's confession weighed heavily on her thoughts, and the fragments of information he had provided began to assemble into a troubling picture. The coercion, the safe, the missing artifacts all pointed to a cunning figure operating behind the scenes. But who? And to what end? Her pencil tapped lightly against the paper as she reviewed the connections. Blake's mysterious note writer had intimate knowledge of his vulnerabilities, a calculated move designed to ensure compliance. Such precision suggested not merely a criminal, but a manipulator with access to information about the ship and its passengers. Her thoughts turned to Charles Emery, his veiled barbs at Lady Eleanor, his feigned indifference, and his unmistakable familiarity with the art and artifact trade all marked him as a man with his own secrets. And while Emery had revelled in hinting at Sir Reginald's questionable dealings, he had been conspicuously silent on the matter of his own transactions. Agatha's sharp eyes drifted to the library shelves, where an ornate bookplate in the corner of one tome caught her attention. She rose, retrieving the volume and studying the plate. It bore the name of a rare book dealer, a dealer she recognized from her past investigations as someone with ties to the underground antiquities market. A small, knowing smile curved her lips. Charles Emery, it seemed, was more deeply entangled in the world of stolen artifacts than he had let on. And if Blake's manipulator shared a connection with Emery, it would not be a stretch to conclude that Emery himself might be the link she needed. Returning to her chair, Agatha jotted a new note: Emery connections to black market. Smuggler's row. The threads were becoming clearer, but there was still one question she could not ignore. If Emery was involved, who else had a stake in ensuring those artifacts left the Majestic Queen undetected? The late afternoon sun streamed through the porthole of Agatha's cabin, casting long golden shadows on the walls. She sat at her small desk, her expression unusually grave. The realization had come to her suddenly, like the final piece of a puzzle snapping into place. The missing artifacts had not left the ship. They were still aboard, hidden somewhere, and whoever had orchestrated their theft intended to smuggle them off when the ship docked in New York. The thought filled her with urgency. The Majestic Queen was a sprawling vessel, its cargo holds and storerooms labyrinthine in their complexity. Yet the very scale of the ship presented an opportunity. If the artifacts had been stowed away, there would be a clear plan to retrieve them at the opportune moment, and Agatha had no intention of waiting for the mastermind to act first. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Charles Emery had both the means and the connections to arrange such a smuggling operation, and his interactions with Lady Eleanor and Dr. Braun suggested he had been maneuvering behind the scenes. But there was still the matter of Blake's crate in the provisions storeroom, and the peculiar movements of other crew members, particularly those who might have unwittingly or knowingly played a part in the plan. Rising from her chair, Agatha began to assemble the tools of her investigation. She wrapped her notebook in its protective cover, tucked a small flashlight into her coat pocket, and donned a sturdy pair of walking shoes. If the artifacts were still aboard, they would require careful handling, likely stored in a secure but inconspicuous location. The provisions area would be her first stop. As she stepped out into the corridor, the ship seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible tension. Passengers moved about with forced cheerfulness, their conversations subdued and wary. Somewhere amid the grandeur and camaraderie, a scheme was unfolding, and Agatha felt the weight of the ticking clock pressing down on her. Her steps quickened as she made her way toward the lower decks, her sharp mind assembling and rearranging the facts as she walked. The mastermind's plan was clever, but not flawless. There were too many variables, too many opportunities for things to go wrong. Agatha Marple had every intention of ensuring that they did. The grand dining room of the Majestic Queen was a study in contrast. Its gilded mirrors and glittering chandeliers spoke of luxury and refinement, yet the tension in the air was palpable. Agatha Marple stood at the center of the room, her calm presence commanding attention as the key passengers and crew gathered around her. "Thank you all for joining me," she began, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I believe we are now in a position to uncover the truth about Sir Reginald Hawthorne's death." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room, noting the expressions of curiosity, unease, and defiance etched on the faces before her. Lady Eleanor sat stiffly, her gloved hands folded in her lap, while Charles Emery leaned casually against a chair, his smirk a little too confident. Dr. Hildegard Braun's sharp eyes flicked between Agatha and the others, while Thomas Blake stood near the back, wringing his hands. Agatha continued. "At first glance, Sir Reginald's death appeared to be natural, a heart attack. But the evidence tells a different story. The scene in his cabin was carefully staged to mislead us. The damp cloth found in his bathroom, for instance, was laced with a potent poison. When pressed to his face, it caused a cardiac arrest, mimicking the symptoms of a natural death. A murmur of shock rippled through the room. Agatha raised a hand to silence it. The scratches on the safe, the misaligned rug, these were deliberate touches, meant to suggest a burglary gone wrong. In truth, they were part of a larger scheme to divert suspicion. Agatha turned to Thomas Blake, her tone gentler but no less firm. "Mr. Blake, you were coerced into opening Sir Reginald's safe. The note you received, threatening your family, was the work of someone who knew exactly how to exploit your vulnerabilities." Blake's face crumpled, and he nodded, his voice trembling as he said, I didn't want to do it, Miss Marple. I swear. They said they'd ruin my sister if I didn't." "I believe you," Agatha said kindly. Then her gaze shifted to Charles Emery, her tone sharpening. "But the person who manipulated you is standing among us." The room fell silent. Emery's smirk faltered, replaced by a fleeting flicker of unease. "Surely you don't mean me," he drawled, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I do," Agatha replied crisply. "Your dealings in the black market are no secret, Mr. Emery, though you've gone to great lengths to conceal them. Your rivalry with Sir Reginald over those stolen artifacts made him a threat to your operation. When you learned he intended to auction them upon arrival in New York, you acted to remove him." Emery's composure cracked, and he straightened, his face darkening. "That's a preposterous accusation." "Is it?" Agatha countered, her eyes narrowing. "The artifacts were never meant to leave this ship. You had them hidden in a crate of linens in the storeroom, intending to retrieve them just before we docked." She turned to Captain Harrington, who stepped forward, holding a small crate. Inside were the missing artifacts' priceless figurines and relics wrapped in cloth. The room erupted into gasps and whispers, but Agatha's voice cut through the noise. Mr. Emery used Mr. Blake as his unwilling accomplice and planned the perfect crime. But as always, greed blinds even the most calculating mind. Agatha raised her hand, quieting the room once more. However, there were others with motives, though not for murder. Lady Eleanor and Dr. Braun were working together, not to harm Sir Reginald, but to expose his thefts. Lady Eleanor's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise. "How did you know?" "You left clues," Agatha said simply. "Your quiet conversations, the documents you carried, and your restrained reaction to his death. Dr. Braun, your disdain for Sir Reginald's methods was clear, but your collaboration with Lady Eleanor suggests you were motivated by justice, not malice." Dr. Braun gave a curt nod, her face unreadable. "We wanted the artifacts returned to their rightful places, but we never intended for him to die." "I believe you," Agatha replied, "and I trust Captain Harrington will ensure that the proper authorities handle the artifacts from here." The Majestic Queen glided into New York Harbor as dawn broke over the city, the Statue of Liberty rising majestically against the golden sky. Agatha Marple stood on the deck, her hands resting lightly on the railing, her thoughts as calm as the waters below. Behind her, Charles Emery was led away in handcuffs, his once confident demeanor replaced by a sullen silence. The other passengers had dispersed, their whispers fading into the ship's corridors. As the city loomed closer, Agatha allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, though the complexities of human nature, its greed, ambition, and desperation lingered in her mind. She smiled faintly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Mysteries, after all, were like the ocean itself, vast, unending, and ever-changing. And as long as there were people, there would always be more to unravel. With that thought, she turned and walked toward the gangway, her small frame dwarfed by the towering ship, but carrying the weight of yet another case quietly solved.